Through the entire time, I was putting myself in a fantasy world that nothing had happened, and that was my defense for everything when I was a kid. Was if something went wrong, ignore it; it'll go away.
Everyone trusted Josh Phillips, the smiling, polite 14-year-old who played baseball, mowed lawns for neighbors, and waved whenever someone passed his yard. He was the perfect kid next door, but for 7 days, while hundreds searched for a missing child, Josh slept above her body. It was early November 1998, in Jacksonville, Florida, a calm, middle-class neighborhood where people still left doors unlocked. 8-year-old Maddie Clifton vanished after going outside to play. One moment she was bouncing a baseball, the next she was gone. Her family called the police, and what followed became one of the most intense missing child searches the state had ever seen. Through it all, Josh joined every search, calm, polite, helping tape flyers to poles, walking beside volunteers, pretending to look for the girl he knew would never come home. To everyone around him, he was the model neighbor kid, doing the right thing. In truth, every moment of that week was theater. By the 7th day, the neighborhood was suffocating under fear. Leads had gone cold. Maddie's mother appeared on live TV, begging for her daughter's return. The city held its breath. Then, on November 10th, Josh's mother, Melissa Phillips, decided to clean his room. She noticed a damp spot near the bottom of his waterbed and a smell that didn't belong in a 14-year-old's room. She leaned closer, trying to find the leak. Then, she lifted the mattress. The smell hit first, then the sight. Melissa didn't stop screaming until she was outside. Under the bed, wrapped in sheets and plastic, was Maddie Clifton, the little girl an entire community had been searching for. Police swarmed the house within minutes. Josh, pale and silent, was led away as stunned neighbors watched. The same boy they trusted had spent 7 nights eating dinner, playing video games, and sleeping inches above his victim. During questioning, Josh broke down. He said Maddie had come over to play baseball. The ball hit her. She cried, and he panicked. He claimed he feared his father's anger, that having a girl in the house broke the rules, and he just wanted her to be quiet. Seconds later, she was silent, and everything changed. Prosecutors never believed it was an accident. They pointed to multiple injuries and the deliberate concealment. To them, Josh wasn't a scared kid. He was calculated enough to hide the body and live normally for a week. What disturbed investigators most wasn't only the act, but the calm that followed. Psychologists later described his behavior as a complete detachment between conscience and reality. At his 1999 trial, the courtroom was packed, wall to wall. Cameras zoomed in on a boy barely tall enough to see over the table. The defense painted him as emotionally stunted, terrified of his father, incapable of rational thought. His mother took the stand, voice shaking. "Josh isn't a monster," she said. "He's my son. He's just a boy who panicked." But the jury couldn't see a frightened boy anymore. They saw a killer who'd hidden his crime beneath his bed and joined the search to cover it up. After a short deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty for first-degree murder. The sentence was mandatory, life in prison without parole. 14 years old, gone forever. The ruling divided the nation. Some said a child had been thrown away without a chance to change. Others said justice had been served for the unimaginable cruelty of his silence. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that automatic life sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional, and Josh's case was reopened. By 2017, he was 33 years old, with more years served than he had ever lived free. His lawyers described him as rehabilitated, a model inmate, tutoring others and expressing deep remorse. Then, Maddie's sister spoke. Her words froze the room. He got to grow up. Maddie didn't. The courtroom fell silent. The judge upheld his life sentence. As of 2025, Josh Phillips remains behind bars at Cross City Correctional Institution in Florida. He has spent 26 years in prison, really twice his age at the time of the crime. For 7 days, a community searched for a missing girl, never realizing her killer was sleeping just a wall away.
I had decided to take the darker path, the evil path. I found that more exciting. Now I'm just Satan himself, so not that I really care.
Every high school has that one kid in black, lost in dark poetry and rebellion. For most, it's a phase. For 16-year-old Rod Farrell, it was a prophecy. In 1996, the small town of Murray, Kentucky, was quiet. The kind of place where teens hung out at the bowling alley, talked about music, and dreamed of leaving. Rod stood apart. He wore trench coats, spoke in riddles, and told anyone who'd listen that he was a 500-year-old vampire named Vesigo. What started as teenage eccentricity soon turned into a cult. He called it the Vampire Clan. To the lonely, he wasn't strange, he was salvation. Rod's magnetism drew in outsiders, misfits, and kids desperate for belonging. Together, they met in cemeteries under the moonlight, slicing their palms, mixing blood, and swearing loyalty. He told them they'd crossed over, that they were now immortal. Behind the fantasy, though, was a deeply unstable teenager, slipping into delusion. By late 1996, Rod's obsession had spiraled. He told his followers they would leave Kentucky behind and start anew in New Orleans, the city of the damned, as he called it. But to get there, they needed a car and money. That's when he turned to 16-year-old Heather Wendorf, a member of his group from Eustis, Florida. Heather had complained about her strict parents. Rod told her he'd save her by freeing her from them entirely. On November 25, 1996, Rod and 3 followers stole a car and drove nearly 800 miles south to Florida. When they reached the Wendorf home, Rod's fantasies collided with reality. He crept through the garage with a crowbar in his hand. When Rod picked it up, the fantasy was over, and something feral took its place. Within minutes, both of Heather's parents, Richard and Ruth Wendorf, were dead. Investigators would later describe the scene as unrestrained rage. To Rod, it was a ritual, the final act of becoming something beyond human. After the killings, he took the family's car, some valuables, and left with his clan, including Heather, who later said she didn't know her parents were dead until hours later. They drove west toward New Orleans, convinced they were free. For a few days, they hid out in a rundown motel in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They used the Wendorf's credit cards to buy food and gas, leaving a digital trail easy to follow. On November 28th, police surrounded their motel. The so-called Vampire Clan surrendered without resistance. What investigators found in their belongings looked like props from a horror movie. Notebooks filled with pentagrams, photos of the group in black clothing, and pages describing blood rituals. But the most chilling part wasn't the evidence. It was Rod's demeanor. He spoke without remorse, like he was recounting a game, not a killing. He bragged about what he'd done, describing the murders as a rush. He told detectives he'd done it for Heather, calling her his Princess of Darkness. The story hit national headlines overnight. To some, it was unthinkable. Teenagers playing vampires and killing in the name of fantasy. To prosecutors, it was simple. A manipulative boy who had weaponized delusion. In 1998, Rod Farrell became one of the youngest people in U.S. history sentenced to death. 16 years old, condemned for murder. His followers received lengthy prison terms. Heather Wendorf was not charged after investigators concluded she hadn't known her parents would be harmed. When the sentence was read, witnesses said Rod showed little reaction, emotionless, distant, as if watching someone else's story unfold. His mother sobbed quietly in the gallery. But the story didn't end there. In 2000, his death sentence was overturned and replaced with life without parole, following changes in juvenile sentencing law. Over time, his legend faded into infamy. Even behind bars, Rod clung to the myth of Vesigo. In interviews, he called himself a vampire without a body, a spirit cursed to walk forever. But psychologists saw something else. Not an immortal, but a narcissist so desperate for control that he built an entire world where he ruled absolutely. In 2018, he faced resentencing under new rulings giving juvenile lifers a chance at review. By then, he was in his late 30s, calm, articulate, almost polite. He told the court he had changed, that he felt deep remorse for the lives he destroyed. But in 2020, the judge reaffirmed his punishment, life without parole. As of 2025, Rod Ferrell remains in Florida State Prison, now 45 years old. The other members of his clan had been released, building quiet lives far from the chaos they once called faith. Rod wasn't a creature of the night. He was a 16-year-old boy who believed his own prophecy and made others believe it too. To their classmates, Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham were just another teenage couple, quiet, shy, always together. They spent their afternoons watching movies, texting each other until sunrise, and dreaming about running away from a world they thought didn't understand them. But in 2016, inside a small house in the English market town of Spalding, that fantasy twisted into one of the most chilling double lives Britain had ever seen. Kim and Lucas were both 14, children on paper, but already living in a secret world of obsession. They called each other soulmates, but theirs wasn't a love story. It was an echo of the dark romance they saw on screen. Kim adored Twilight, the fantasy of eternal love and escape. Lucas played along, promising that they'd always be together, no matter the cost. Behind closed doors, their relationship grew toxic. Kim's home life was fractured. She blamed her mother, Elizabeth Edwards, for breaking up the family after years of tension. Her sister, Katie, was 11, cheerful, trusting, and completely unaware of what her older sister was planning. Lucas, meanwhile, was dealing with his own trauma. He'd been expelled from school, lived in foster care, and told friends he felt like nothing. Together, they found comfort in each other's bitterness. By the spring of 2016, their conversations turned darker. They fantasized about running away, and then about what they called a fresh start. In a series of messages later recovered by police, Kim told Lucas that her mother deserved it, that she wanted to be with him without anyone in the way. Lucas replied, "I'll do anything for you." On the night of April 13th, 2016, the two teens put their plan into motion. Lucas entered Kim's house through a window, carrying a knife from his foster home. They crept upstairs while the rest of the family slept. What happened next would shock the entire country. By morning, Elizabeth and Katie Edwards were dead. Their killers didn't flee. Instead, Kim and Lucas settled into a calm that defied belief. They drew the curtains, ran a bath together, watched Twilight DVDs, ate ice cream, and slept side by side in the same house where Kim's mother and sister lay lifeless. For more than 12 hours, they lived in that dreamlike haze, talking, laughing, and whispering that they were finally free. The next day, when a friend grew suspicious after not hearing from Elizabeth, police arrived at the home. They found the teens in bed together. Kim was calm. Lucas barely spoke. Investigators later said it was the most emotionless crime scene they had ever encountered. During questioning, Lucas confessed quickly. He said he did it for Kim, that she asked, and he agreed. Kim didn't deny it. In fact, she told detectives she felt relieved. Her motive was chillingly simple. She wanted her mother out of the way. When the case went to trial later that year, the courtroom was packed with journalists and psychologists trying to understand how two children could commit something so methodical and then behave so normally afterward. Prosecutors argued that Lucas had carried out the killings, but that Kim was the mastermind. They called her calculating and detached, while describing Lucas as devoted and naive. Kim sat silently through most of the trial, showing little reaction. When asked if she loved her mother, she said, "Not anymore." When the jury heard that the pair had spent hours watching Twilight immediately after the murders, a reporter described the courtroom atmosphere as frozen disbelief. The defense leaned heavily on their age and mental state. They were only 14. Both had histories of depression and trauma. Their lawyers argued that they had lost touch with reality, that they were living inside a fantasy of love and control. But the evidence was overwhelming. In 2016, both Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham were convicted of double murder. The judge described them as extraordinarily cold and self-absorbed. They were sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 20 years each, later reduced to 17 and a half on appeal. Even after sentencing, neither seemed to grasp the magnitude of what they'd done. In recorded interviews, they talked about their plans for the future, about writing letters to each other, about how they'd still be together one day. As of 2025, both remain incarcerated in the UK, still serving their minimum terms. Kim is 23, Lucas 24. The two are no longer in contact, but their names remain inseparable, a dark partnership preserved in headlines.
I just couldn't sleep. I had a hard time sleeping. So what'd you do when you were in your sister's room? You know, I completely turned off my conscience. I really did. You know, I just let the beats come out.
In Albuquerque, New Mexico, the Griego family was known for their faith. They sang in church, helped feed the homeless, and preached forgiveness to anyone who'd listen. At the center of it all was 15-year-old Nehemiah Griego, the pastor's son, the boy with the easy smile and the acoustic guitar. He wore Christian wristbands, quoted scripture, and volunteered at youth ministry. But behind the hymns and Sunday smiles, Nehemiah was living a double life, one built on anger, loneliness, and secret plans he kept hidden from everyone who loved him. It started small. His friends noticed he was withdrawing. He stopped laughing during church events, started dressing darker, and spent hours locked in his room playing violent video games. His father, Greg Griego, a respected former pastor and prison chaplain, worried but believed faith would guide his son back. What no one knew was that Nehemiah was spending his nights online, reading about mass shootings, studying weapon models, and imagining how it would feel to become infamous. By early 2013, those fantasies had turned into something worse, a plan. On January 19th, while his mother and siblings slept, Nehemiah walked into his parents' bedroom carrying a .22 rifle. What happened next would destroy an entire family and shake his church to its core. Authorities later said the attack was methodical. He first targeted his mother, Sarah, then turned the gun on his youngest siblings, Jael, Zephaniah, and Angelina, ages 9, 5, and 2. When his father returned home hours later, Nehemiah was waiting. He shot him at the doorway. It took less than an hour to wipe out everyone inside the Griego house. But the most chilling part came afterward. Nehemiah didn't panic. He didn't run. Instead, he packed his things, a guitar, some ammunition, and family photos, and drove away in the family van. He spent the next several hours visiting a friend and later his church, smiling, joking, and talking about going on a mission trip. That same night, he confided to a friend that something bad had happened at home. The friend didn't believe him, not until police showed up at the Griego residence and found the scene inside. The story spread nationwide within hours. Pastor's son murders his entire family. To many, it was unthinkable. The Griegos weren't just respected, they were beloved. Greg had dedicated his life to reforming inmates and mentoring youth, the kind of man who believed no soul was beyond redemption. Now, his own son had carried out an act that defied comprehension. When police interviewed Nehemiah, they expected a breakdown. Instead, they found calm indifference. He told investigators he'd been thinking about killing for years. He said he wanted to make a statement, that he'd planned to go to a Walmart afterward and continue shooting until police stopped him. He described each step of the murders in a flat tone, as if reading from a manual. Detectives said his lack of emotion was unnerving, like watching someone describe a dream they didn't wake up from. In the weeks that followed, psychologists and prosecutors struggled to understand who Nehemiah really was. Some saw a deeply disturbed teen battling depression and delusions. Others saw a manipulative killer who knew exactly what he was doing. At first, he was charged as an adult, facing life in prison. But his defense argued that his youth and mental state made rehabilitation possible. The courtroom became a clash between faith and justice, between those who saw a lost child and those who saw cold-blooded evil. His surviving relatives, members of the same church community that had once adored him, sat through every hearing. Many couldn't even look at him. Yet a few, incredibly, spoke of forgiveness. "We have to," one relative said. "It's what Greg would have wanted." In 2019, after years of legal battles, a New Mexico judge ruled that Nehemiah would be sentenced as an adult. He received multiple life terms to be served concurrently, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. In 2023, the state Supreme Court upheld that ruling, rejecting claims that the sentence was too harsh for a juvenile. By then, Nehemiah was in his mid-20s, still young, but no longer the smiling boy from the church photos. Journalists who've interviewed him since describe two very different people: the polite, reflective inmate who quotes scripture, and the detached storyteller who recounts the killings with surgical detail. As of 2025, Nehemiah Griego is serving his sentence in New Mexico, eligible for parole sometime in the 2040s. The small church where his father once preached has never fully recovered. The congregation rebuilt its walls, but not its certainty. In the eyes of his community, Nehemiah had been the embodiment of faith and promise. But behind that perfect image was something no one could see, a quiet obsession waiting for its moment.
Welcome.
2.
Camera.
Information.
3.
Daniel Bartlam looked like any other British teenager. The quiet 14-year-old from Nottingham, obsessed with video games, comic books, and the TV dramas he watched with his family. His teachers described him as polite, if a little withdrawn. But in April 2011, Daniel turned that screen obsession into something horrifying, a murder that looked less like reality and more like a scene from the soap operas he loved. At the center of it all was his mother, Jacqueline Bartlam, kind, hard-working, and proud of her son. To neighbors, they seemed close, but inside their small suburban home, tension had been building. Daniel had grown moody, resentful, and cold. He fought constantly with his mother about grades, gaming, and rules. Jacqueline believed it was normal teenage rebellion. It wasn't. In secret, Daniel had been writing a story, a violent fantasy script about a boy named Daniel who killed his mother. It was detailed, even cinematic. The weapon, the aftermath, the fire meant to erase the evidence. To him, it wasn't fiction anymore. It was preparation. On April 25th, 2011, while the rest of the UK celebrated Easter Monday, Daniel made his fantasy real. He waited until his mother was watching television, then picked up a claw hammer and attacked her. The strike was sudden, brutal, and final. Moments later, he dragged her body into her bedroom, doused the room in lighter fluid, and set it on fire. As flames began to spread, Daniel packed a small bag, grabbed his pet hamster, and fled into the night. When firefighters arrived, they thought it was a tragic house fire, but as they sifted through the wreckage, they found Jacqueline's body and realized immediately that something didn't fit. The burns were localized. The The fire hadn't killed her. She was already gone before it started. The next morning, police found Daniel, wandering nearby, calm and composed. He told officers that an intruder had broken in and killed his mother, claiming he'd barely escaped the fire. But when detectives pressed for details, his story fell apart within hours. They found the hammer, the lighter, and, most damning of all, the fictional script he'd written weeks before, a near-perfect mirror of the real crime. It read like a screenplay. Scene by scene, it described a boy killing his mother with a hammer and burning the house to hide what he'd done. When confronted with the script, Daniel froze. Then, slowly, he admitted that he'd done it, but claimed it was an act of temporary madness. He said he didn't mean to kill her, that he was acting out. Prosecutors didn't believe him. At trial, the prosecution portrayed him as calculating and cold. They pointed to the written story, the careful staging, and the total lack of panic afterward. The judge called it chilling in its precision. The defense countered with a claim of diminished responsibility, that Daniel was mentally fragile, lost between fantasy and reality. Psychologists examined him for months. Some said he showed signs of narcissism and emotional detachment. Others argued he was simply immature and obsessed with violent media. But what everyone agreed on was this: Daniel had blurred the line between fiction and life. In 2012, Daniel Bartlam was found guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years. For Jacqueline's family, the verdict brought little comfort. Her relatives told reporters that she'd lived for her children, that she'd believed Daniel was just going through a rough patch. They couldn't understand how he could plan something so cruel, so rehearsed, and then calmly walk away from the burning house. In interviews years later, detectives said the hardest part of the case wasn't the violence. It was how ordinary it all seemed. He wasn't evil-looking, and that's what made it terrifying. In prison, Daniel has rarely spoken publicly. He's been described as quiet, compliant, and obsessed with reading, though some guards say he still talks about his favorite TV dramas as if they're more real than his own life. As of 2025, Daniel Bartlam remains behind bars in the UK, now in his late 20s. He will be eligible for parole in the late 2020s, though experts believe his release would spark public outrage. Daniel Bartlam wanted to be the writer, the director, and the star. But in the end, he became the villain, trapped forever in the script he wrote himself. In the late 1980s, the quiet suburb of Warwick, Rhode Island, looked like the picture of safety. Families left bikes in driveways, kids played until dark, and neighbors greeted each other with smiles. And among those smiling faces was a boy named Craig Price. Funny, athletic, polite. Everyone knew him. Everyone liked him. No one imagined that by age 15, he'd become one of America's youngest serial killers. Craig grew up in a working-class neighborhood, the youngest of 3 kids. He loved football and made friends easily. Teachers called him bright, even charming. But behind that easy grin, something darker was growing. Anger, impulsivity, and a fascination with violence. He was just 13 when he killed for the first time. The victim was Rebecca Spencer, a 27-year-old woman who lived 2 doors down. It was July 27th, 1987, a humid summer night. Rebecca was packing boxes, preparing to move. At some point that night, Craig broke into her house. What happened inside shocked even seasoned investigators. And yet, for 2 years, the case went unsolved. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, no reason to suspect the polite teenager who lived nearby. Then, in September 1989, Craig killed again. This time, his victims were Joan Heaton, a 39-year-old mother, and her 2 daughters, Jennifer, 10, and Melissa, 8. The family lived just a few blocks from Craig. They were found days later after relatives grew worried. Police described the scene as one of the worst in Rhode Island history. For days, The small community couldn't comprehend what had happened. Who could do something like this, and why? The answer came from a trail of evidence. A bloody handprint, footprints matching sneakers Craig owned, and a confession that stunned even the detectives who'd suspected him. When confronted, Craig Price admitted everything. No hesitation, no emotion. He told police he'd broken into the Heaton home to steal, then attacked when Joan woke up. He described the murders in chilling detail, laughing at points during the interview. When asked why, he said simply, "It felt good." He was 15 years old. At first, officers thought he was lying, maybe trying to protect someone older. But every detail he gave matched the evidence exactly. The arrest sent shockwaves through the state. This wasn't a hardened criminal or a man with a long record. This was a kid, a local football player, a neighbor's son, a boy who rode his bike past the same houses where he'd taken lives. Legally, the situation was complicated. Because Craig was 15, state law required he be tried as a juvenile. That meant that no matter how many people he killed, he could only be held until his 21st birthday. 6 years for 4 murders. The public was outraged. During evaluations, psychologists labeled Craig as impulsive, intelligent, and completely remorseless. He joked with guards, mocked reporters, and told other inmates that he'd beat the system. Inside the youth facility, he became a celebrity among delinquents, confident, laughing, and utterly unbothered. As his 21st birthday approached in 1994, prosecutors scrambled to keep him locked up. They tried charging him for prison assaults, behavioral violations, anything to extend his sentence. But Craig saw it coming. He bragged that no one could stop him from walking free. "You can't keep me forever," he said in one recorded interview. "When I get out, I'll be right back." That quote terrified everyone, and it turned out he meant it. Over the next decades, Craig's life behind bars became a saga of violence and defiance. He attacked guards, threatened staff, and stabbed another inmate in 2017, earning 25 additional years on top of his original time. Any hope of parole evaporated. Today, Craig Price is no longer the smiling neighbor from Warwick. He's a middle-aged man, still serving time in a Florida prison, transferred there after years of disciplinary issues in Rhode Island. He will likely never be released. His case changed Rhode Island law forever, prompting new rules that allow juveniles accused of heinous crimes to be tried as adults. It also shattered the illusion that age alone can define innocence.
Some voices were talking to me, "You need to make a sacrifice or we're going to come and get you, you need to do it." And I saw him, it was laying on the grass. I stabbed him first there, and I've done it a few times. While I was doing that, my voices were laughing and laughing and laughing louder and louder.
In 2014, the English town of Colchester was shaken by 2 random and brutal killings. The attacker wasn't a seasoned criminal or a man with a history of violence. He was 15-year-old James Fairweather, a quiet, bullied student who dreamed of becoming a serial killer. On the surface, James was just another awkward teenager. He played video games, wore hoodies, and kept to himself. But inside, his mind was dark and obsessive. He studied famous murderers, idolized their power, and talked online about wanting to be the next one. He wasn't just fascinated by violence. He was planning to create his own legacy. It began on March 29th, 2014. James roamed the streets of Colchester, carrying a knife he'd stolen. His first victim was a 23-year-old soldier named James Atfield, who was walking home after a night out. Atfield had suffered a brain injury years earlier, leaving him vulnerable and unsteady. When James found him sitting on a park bench, he saw an opportunity. The attack was frenzied and senseless. By the time it was over, the young soldier was dead. The violence shocked investigators and terrified the town, but there were no witnesses and no suspect. For months, the case went cold. Then, nearly 3 months later, James struck again. On June 17th, he followed 44-year-old Nahid Al-Manea, a Saudi Arabian student studying at the University of Essex. She was walking to class, dressed in traditional clothing, when he attacked her without warning. She never had a chance to scream. The people of Colchester were paralyzed with fear. Police flooded the streets, warning residents not to walk alone. For weeks, investigators searched for patterns, clues, anything to explain who was behind the violence. But the killer was still out there, blending in with everyone else. To his classmates, James seemed the same, withdrawn, awkward, invisible. At home, he spent hours in his room, scrolling through crime stories and news coverage of his own attacks. Detectives later learned that James had a list. On it were the names of people he planned to kill next, all strangers. He wanted to commit at least 5 murders, then get caught so that his name would be remembered. But his plan fell apart one night in May 2015, nearly a year after the killings. A police patrol spotted him loitering near a wooded path, wearing gloves and carrying a knife. When officers stopped him, he didn't run. Instead, he told them, "I was going to kill someone tonight." At first, they thought he was bluffing, just another disturbed teen seeking attention. But once they searched his bag and found the weapon, the truth became impossible to ignore. In interrogation, James described the murders in shocking detail. He said voices had told him to do it, that he was chosen, that it was his destiny. He spoke about his victims with chilling detachment, calling the killings practice. He even smiled while recounting them. Forensic psychologists diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, noting hallucinations and violent fantasies. But prosecutors argued that he knew exactly what he was doing, that he was proud of it. At trial, the defense tried to convince the jury that James was insane, too mentally ill to be responsible. The prosecution countered that he had planned every step, choosing his victims, timing the attacks, and studying the media coverage afterward. The judge agreed. In 2015, James Fairweather was convicted of 2 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 27 years. When the verdict was read, his parents wept. They said they begged for help years earlier, that their son had been bullied, depressed, and obsessed with death, but no one took their fears seriously. Even in prison, James has remained disturbingly calm. Fellow inmates described him as polite and quiet. He spends his days reading and writing, rarely speaking to anyone. But on the few occasions he has been interviewed, he's shown no remorse. His victims were random. His motive was fame, and his mask was the face of a lonely teenager the world never thought to fear. As of 2025, James Fairweather remains in custody in the UK. He will be eligible for parole in the 2040s, though few believe he'll ever be released.
I was in a science classroom and we just heard screaming from upstairs, and then everyone sort of ran down and the teachers were running up with bandages and stuff and saying that ambulances and police were on the way. After lunch we saw on one of the news websites that she'd been stabbed and she'd died later on at the hospital.
In 2014, at Corpus Christi Catholic College in Leeds, England, students were sitting through another ordinary Monday. Laughter in the halls, papers shuffling, teachers calling attendance. And then, in the middle of an afternoon Spanish class, a 15-year-old student named Will Cornick stood up, walked to the front of the room, and committed one of the most shocking classroom murders in British history. Will Cornick wasn't the kind of student anyone feared. He was intelligent, polite, and often described as bright but lazy. Teachers said he could have gone far if he'd cared more. His classmates saw him as sarcastic and funny, maybe a little rebellious, but harmless. He even got along with his Spanish teacher, Anne Maguire. She was 61, beloved by her students, and weeks away from retirement. To her, Will was another bright kid she believed could do better. To him, she was a target. In the weeks leading up to the attack, Will's behavior began to change. He talked openly about hating school, about wanting to hurt someone. He showed friends a knife he carried in his backpack. Most thought it was a joke, that he was just being edgy, like any teenage boy craving attention. They were wrong. On April 28th, 2014, Will walked into school like it was any other day. He joked with friends, handed in homework, and waited for Spanish class. But in his mind, everything was already decided. He'd spent months fantasizing about killing Anne Maguire. He told classmates it would be funny, that he didn't care if he got caught. That afternoon, while Anne helped another student at the front of the class, Will pulled out a knife with a 6-inch blade and attacked her from behind. The classroom froze. Students screamed and ran. Anne stumbled toward the hallway, bleeding and terrified, as colleagues rushed to her aid. But it was too late. The beloved teacher, who had spent 4 decades shaping young lives, was gone, murdered by a student she'd once encouraged. Police arrived within minutes. Will was calm, emotionless. When officers asked him why he did it, he said, "I just felt like it." He told them he'd planned a killing for over a year, ever since she'd given him a detention he thought was unfair. He said he wanted to see what it would be like. Investigators quickly realized they weren't dealing with a moment of rage. This was premeditated. On his computer, they found notes describing his fantasy in detail. He wrote that he wanted to kill 2 teachers and 1 student, and that he didn't care if he spent the rest of his life in prison. Psychiatrists who examined Will later said he displayed signs of extraordinary callousness and almost clinical lack of empathy. One described him as chillingly remorseless. At his trial later that year, prosecutors emphasized his complete indifference. They told the court that Will smiled as he described what he'd done. When asked how he felt about Anne Maguire's death, he said, "Regret? I don't have any." His defense lawyer, grasping for explanation, pointed to possible undiagnosed mental illness, depression, immaturity, or even delusion, but none of it matched the cold precision of his planning. The judge said the murder was unprovoked, brutal, and entirely motivated by hatred. In November 2014, Will Cornick was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years before parole eligibility. He showed no visible emotion when the sentence was read. Outside the courthouse, the nation reacted with disbelief. Teachers across the country held vigils for Anne Maguire, placing candles and flowers outside school gates. Her husband described her as the soul of kindness. Her students wrote letters, calling her the teacher who never gave up on anyone. Meanwhile, reports emerged about Will's behavior after his arrest. In custody, he laughed with other inmates, bragged about the crime, and said he'd do it again. Those words turned public sympathy into outrage. As of 2025, Will Cornick remains in prison, now 26 years old. His first chance at parole will come in the mid-1930s, though experts doubt he'll ever be deemed safe for release. For those who knew Anne Maguire, the pain never faded. She had spent 40 years believing in the goodness of her students, that even the most difficult ones could change. And in her final moments, she faced the one student who proved her wrong. By all accounts, 16-year-old Stephen Miles was an ordinary British teenager. He studied politics, loved movies, and kept most to himself. To teachers, he was quiet but intelligent, a student who blended into the background. To friends, he was the kind of kid who cracked dark jokes but never meant any harm. He lived with his family in Oxted, a small town in Surrey, calm, safe, the kind of place where nothing truly bad ever happened. But in January 2014, that illusion shattered when Stephen committed a crime that shocked even the most seasoned investigators, a murder inspired by a TV show and carried out under the influence of what he claimed was an alter ego named Ed. Stephen's life had begun to unravel months before. He'd been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome and depression. He spent long hours isolated in his room, watching shows like Dexter, the series about a forensic analyst who moonlights as a vigilante killer. Friends said Stephen was obsessed with it. He'd quote lines, analyze scenes, and call himself Dexter in training. But beneath the fascination, his mental state was deteriorating. He told classmates he heard voices. He said they belonged to someone else. Ed, a violent alter personality who gave him commands. At first, nobody took him seriously. They thought it was part of his dark humor, another layer of irony from a quiet, quirky boy. Then came January 23rd, 2014. That afternoon, Stephen invited his girlfriend, Elizabeth Thomas, over to his house. She was 17, kind, cheerful, and patient with his mood swings. The two spent time in his bedroom, listening to music and talking. Then, without warning, Stephen attacked her. He moved behind her, grabbed a knife he had hidden nearby, and struck with cold precision. When it was over, he called his sister into the room. His clothes were stained. His expression, she said later, was empty. Stephen told her calmly, "Ed made me do something bad." His family immediately called police. When officers arrived, Stephen didn't resist. He simply said, "I'm sorry. I have to be arrested now." The crime scene was devastating. Investigators said it was one of the most disturbing they had seen, not just because of the violence, but because of the calm that surrounded it. Everything had been methodical, deliberate. Stephen had acted out what he'd seen on television, as if he were performing a script rather than living a reality. During interrogation, Stephen's explanations were chilling. He told detectives that Ed had taken control, that he'd been instructed to kill Elizabeth. He claimed the alter ego had been living inside him for years, violent, cold, and obsessed with power. When asked if he felt remorse, Stephen said, "I feel like I had to." Psychologists were divided. Some believed Stephen genuinely suffered from a dissociative disorder. Others argued he was using his mental health as a shield, rationalizing a killing he'd long fantasized about. One expert said, whether Ed was real or imagined, Stephen gave him permission. At trial, prosecutors presented a picture, liberation and discipline of consciousness. They said Stephen had staged his crime like an episode of Dexter. The defense countered with his mental health history, his diagnoses, his medications, his hallucinations. They said Stephen had been unraveling for months, crying out for help that never came. But even his own family couldn't understand how his delusions turned into murder. When the verdict came, guilty of murder, Stephen showed little emotion. His lawyers requested leniency based on his age and mental illness, but the judge refused. "You intended to kill," he said. "You knew exactly what you were doing." In October 2014, Stephen Miles was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. After sentencing, Stephen's family released a statement, expressing heartbreak for Elizabeth's loved ones. His father said, "We didn't see it coming. None of us did." As of 2025, Stephen Miles is 30, still serving his sentence. His parole eligibility won't come until the late 2030s. His case became known as the Dexter Killer, not because he was clever, but because he mistook fiction for identity. Some see Stephen as a tragic example of untreated mental illness mixed with media obsession. Others see something colder, a teenager who used a fictional killer to justify becoming one.
Yo, what's up guys, it's Aaron Campbell here, again for another video. So yeah, thank you guys very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, and if you want to see more, please subscribe. I really appreciate all the subscribers and all the support. Thank you guys very much, and roll the clip.
The Isle of Bute is the kind of place people move to when they want peace. A quiet Scottish island of a few thousand residents, surrounded by water and calm. Everyone knew everyone. People still left their doors unlocked. And among the familiar faces was 16-year-old Aaron Campbell, smiling, friendly, and seemingly harmless. He played guitar, posted funny clips online, and volunteered at local charity runs. To neighbors, he was polite, athletic, and well-liked. The perfect example of a good kid in a small town. But what no one knew was that behind that ordinary charm was a darkness that had been growing quietly for years. On the night of July 1st, 2018, 6-year-old Alessia MacPhail was staying at her grandparents' house while visiting the island for the summer. She'd gone to bed happy, excited to see her dad the next day. By morning, her bed was empty. Her grandparents searched every room, every corner of the house. Panic spread across the island. Police arrived within minutes, and neighbors joined the search. Even Aaron Campbell volunteered to help, walking through the woods, asking questions, pretending to share their fear. Just hours later, the search ended. Alessia's body was found in a wooded area less than a mile away. She had been abducted, raped, and murdered in a place that prided itself on safety and kindness. The unthinkable had happened. Someone had taken a child in the night, and everyone was desperate to believe it wasn't one of their own. Detectives began with the usual possibilities: strangers, visitors, outsiders. But then they reviewed CCTV footage from that night. At 2:26 a.m., a tall, barefoot figure was seen walking through the neighborhood, carrying something in his arms. When officers questioned Aaron, he was calm, almost too calm. He said he'd been at home all night, playing video games and sleeping. His story was simple, believable, and delivered with confidence. But forensic evidence soon dismantled it. DNA found in Alessia's body matched his. When confronted with the proof, Aaron didn't cry or deny it. He smiled. "Okay," he said quietly, "you've got me." That phrase sent chills through the interview room. What came next was worse. Aaron described what he had done in a tone detectives later called flat, analytical. He said he had wanted to see what it felt like to hurt someone, that he'd been thinking about doing it for years. He spoke as if describing a movie, not a crime. Officers said his expression never changed. He wasn't angry or nervous. He was curious. Everyone had once trusted Aaron, the boy who smiled at the grocery store, who waved at neighbors. And now he was the face of their worst nightmare. At trial, prosecutors described Aaron as cold, callous, calculating, and remorseless. They told the jury he had stalked his victim in the dark. When caught, he showed not an ounce of regret, only frustration that he'd been found out. He didn't just lack empathy, he lacked recognition that empathy even mattered. One doctor said, "He is highly intelligent, self-aware, and frighteningly indifferent." When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the judge addressed him directly. "You have shown not one shred of remorse. You are a cold, manipulative, dangerous individual." Aaron was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years. Even after conviction, he remained eerily composed. He wrote letters claiming he had been framed, then retracted them. He joked with other inmates. One guard later told reporters, "He doesn't seem to understand what he's done. It's like he's studying everyone else's grief." In 2019, his sentence was reduced to 24 years on appeal, a decision that sparked national outrage. Many believed that someone so cold should never have the chance to walk free. People who'd known Aaron since childhood now avoided eye contact, unable to reconcile the smiling boy they remembered with the monster in court. Aaron Campbell will be eligible for parole in the 2040s, though few believe he'll ever be released. His name has become synonymous with betrayal, the predator who hid in plain sight. From the smiling boy next door to the quiet girl with a secret plan, these 10 teenagers lived lives that fooled everyone around them. They were the classmates, the neighbors, the kids who seemed ordinary until the mask slipped. Their stories are proof that evil doesn't always wear the face of a monster. Sometimes it hides behind a school uniform, a shy smile, or a helping hand. And when it finally reveals itself, it leaves behind families shattered and communities forever changed. They are, without question, among the most evil teens the world has ever seen. If you found this exploration into their chilling double lives compelling, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share your thoughts on these stories in the comments below. Which case disturbed you the most?